Okay, you can start, Prof.
So welcome everybody to the CME, and thanks to the Clinician Society for arranging it. As you can see, we've got a nice provocative topic that we haven't engaged with, certainly not substantively in the past. I think it's a long history with those of us involved in HIVs dealing with topics which didn't naturally come comfortably to us. You know, I remember dealing, when I first entered into the HIV field, having to deal with sex and sexuality, and then with a whole range of communities, such as sex workers, the LGBTI community, and more recently having to engage honestly on the issue of drugs and people who use them. And I think for somebody like me, who's very conventionally trained, it's been a real challenge having to get my head around some evolving concepts around drug use and really complicated issues such as addiction and the language that gets used, and having to do with my own upbringing, which I think for every one of us in South Africa, which is a very, let's admit it, conservative community, have all had to deal with. So tonight we've got three people. I must say, these people have educated me extensively over the last few years as we've engaged about developing guidelines around this. Have modified my thinking and made me think about things very differently, and I hope are as provocative for you this evening. So we're going to be taking you through the three speakers, Dimakatso, Shaun, and Andrew, all of whom are experts in their field. Shaun and Andrew have got slides, and Dimakatso is going to be speaking to us with her personal experiences. Just to, in terms of, I'm just trying to advance my slides. Sorry, there we go. So just so you know, the webinar will be recorded, as with most of the webinars the Clinician Society does, and will be available more than that. Will you please just type your questions into the chat box? We're not going to allow an open season just because it's chaotic doing that, especially with everyone's different bandwidths and everything else we've had to deal with in the last little while. I think we've all become Zoom experts. And for those of you who are in good standing, you're eligible for a CPD certificate. So just fill in all of those. Although again, I think that the Zoom era has meant that all of us have CPD points to spare at the moment. To thank for UnitAid and the Clinician Society for arranging all of this, UnitAid for sponsoring it, and for making this available, to making sure that the webcast is broadcast and available to all of you. Just to highlight that there are lots of other online courses the Clinician Society is getting involved in and will be making available to you. And if you need any of the details of this, just go online or contact the Clinician Society directly to Lauren and her amazing team. But for tonight, it gives me great pleasure I'm going to stop screen sharing now, just so that I can just draw up the speakers' bios. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, which is Dimakatso Nonyane, who's a clinical associate, and many of us have, been had engagement with the clinical associates as a newish cohort of healthcare providers. But she's remarkable in the sense that she actually has an honors degree in community health psychology. She's a clinical lecturer and training coordinator within the community-oriented primary care research unit at the Department of Family Medicine at the University of Pretoria. The University of Pretoria, paradoxically, is actually probably some of the best experts in this field that we're going to be hearing from, and has certainly taught me a lot in terms of engagements around drug use. She oversees the drugs and substance use related education for staff, communities, and relevant stakeholders across programs managed by her research unit. So she's going to be our first speaker, and then we'll hand over to Shaun. Over to you, Dimakatso.
Thank you so much, Francois. It's kind of weird not having an audience. I'm used to seeing faces and reactions, but because when you mention harm reduction, you get to thank you, Andrew. When you mention harm reduction, And all of that it composes, you see a lot of reactions from different participants. Thanks, Shaun. So harm reduction. I was first introduced to this whirlwind 2016. I was new from a hospital. I used to work in internal medicine, and it was just kind of depressing. Internal medicine, people are at the end of their conditions by then. So I was introduced to the concept that we are going to save all drug users from drugs. I was amped with it and excited to be at the forefront and save people from their own choices. This proceeded to how COSUB started, the community-oriented substance use. We were placed in community, we were in the midst of it as we got to engage with different substance users. And I can remember those first few months, so amped up and thinking that I'm going to change the world. Subsequently to that, a period came when I got discouraged. People were not changing the way I had told them to change. I would told them that this is what they needed to do to fix their substance use, to fix their lives. Stop using this drug, stop doing that. But they somehow did not change. This led to a state of just sheer depression. I stopped being so enthusiastic. I just started chilling in a sense. Those who pay my salary, I promise you I still worked hard. I stopped trying to change lives. And something remarkable happened in that period. I just started having casual conversations. I remember my clients, they would walk in the office and I stopped having conversations around how much drugs did you use? How many times did you get triggered this week? Is your methadone fine? Did you inject? Did you hang out with the same people we told you not to hang out with? Those questions became irrelevant and we started having questions around, how are you? And they started to see that I was not my usual energetic, enthusiastic self. And one client told me that, you know, Dee, it takes a lot for us to keep trying to get better over and over again. And he says, if I can do it, you can get up again. And that was it. When I started seeing them save me from my discouragement, and somehow they became my clinician along the way, and it finally clicked. This whole thing that I've not just been presenting to my staff and my colleagues, but to other stakeholders, I was presenting harm reduction. But I realized that at that time, what harm reduction meant then is that it was a tool for me to manipulate people to come to my end, to my concepts of what they should be. And ultimately it was not working. I lost client, retention became even far low. And most importantly, the conversations I was having were prescripted. Client gave me what they knew I needed to hear. We all know this, patients give us what they think we need to hear. And I missed out on an opportunity to really see what their context is like and honor the fact that they are masters. So this is how my journey from thinking I'm practicing harm reduction to actually practicing harm reduction was when I started to build honest relationships with my clients. You see, ultimately, we can't force people to do whatever we want them to do. This we know, we appreciate it in life. But when it comes to substance users, I think there was a concept from my end that believed that they had missed a mark. They have missed an understanding on how to better equip and manage their lives. And it was in that space when I realized I took them and I made myself the master of their context. Harm reduction destroyed my concept of indifferent kindness. In most cases, when we engage with substance users, we think we are being kind, but in most cases, we are simply being indifferent. We refuse to sit down and engage. We refuse to acknowledge the fact that they are still human beings, but most importantly, they are unique. in their experiences and the complexities that come with substance use. Ultimately, harm reduction gave me that platform where I could sit down and prioritize their lives above my moral standing. Prioritize the fact that, honest to God, with all that they had to deal with, I could not even begin to try and adjust to it. But ultimately, they were still here. They were still coming. They still needed needles. They still cared about their health. And they wanted a space, an area that said, I will honor and not disregard the fact that your health still matters. And this is what harm reduction did for me. And I hope that it is a space where we can all start embracing the fact that nothing, absolutely nothing, should take priorities above saving lives. This is a mandate we should all carry and aim to protect above all things. Whether we have different concepts about what life should be, that should be the ultimate thing. So I just want to tell you about a client of mine. And yes, she consented to this. I just can't use her name. This young lady walked in the site for the first time, very skeptical and pretty much more nervous than I am now. She came to us very shy and she came for needles. She met with one of our peer educators. They have the conversation and they exchange needles. So I started just to say hi. I didn't know her name. Then she came several times, got to know her name. All we had to do was just say hi and greet her by her name and give her a smile, and she would leave, come back. Then she started to come just to chill and relax with us, just to have a day of chilling and having random conversations. Then subsequently, she's asked that, why are you different? I'm like, what do you mean? She's like, when I'm here, I feel that I'm just another girl on the street passing another girl. I didn't get to appreciate that as much as now I understand that in most cases, when you have someone work in your health care service, they have already taken all of that stigma. They've already defined for you how you see them, and they've internalized that. And just by a simple thing as a smile and acknowledging someone by their identity, it shattered all of those things, and we got to engage. We proceeded to have contraceptive conversations. We proceeded to have conversations about her testing for HIV. We proceeded to her studying OST. And right now she's employed. She works at one of our organizations. She's a counselor and she helps other people. This started with a simple smile and an acknowledgement towards her. So for me, when it boils down to the question of what is harm reduction, why harm reduction, it works. To simply give one borderline approach to say abstinence is the key, it's either you engage with it or not. It is to be indifferent to the different circumstances that people find themselves in. Substance use is complicated. Substances will continue to be in our communities, and people will need to escape their harsh realities or use substances for whatever reason they need to use it. I don't get to stand in the way of that by saying that I will not make sure that you get the best healthcare service that I can provide you. As healthcare providers, we all came to this field for one reason or the other. From a state of wanting to save the world like I wanted to do by my way, or from just by haphazard. But ultimately, just like my clients acknowledged me when I needed them, that I'm a human being first and foremost, and they respected that. They gave me dignity, even though I wasn't willing to engage with them. They acknowledged that I'm uniquely different. And in that, they gave me autonomy, the right to choose how to engage with them. And that's the challenge And I pray that all of us will open our hearts and our minds to this concept, not because it's a new concept to follow. Ask ourselves that, does what we do save lives or not? And that is the primary basis of harm reduction. Is what you are doing in terms of people who use substances and people who inject drugs, are you saving their lives? Are you on the pathway and building on saving their lives? If not, then we need to relook and reevaluate ourselves and not allow any stigma to stand in the way of ensuring, because ultimately you can't give treatment to someone who's already passed on. No dead person can be rehabilitated. Thank you.
Thank you, and that was a wonderful introduction, Dimakatso, and thank you for setting the scene. And you're going to be sticking around for questions later so that people can probe these experiences. So thank you for that. Next up, I've got Shaun Shelly, who's going to, when I first started wandering through this, I think like many of you on the call as a clinician, as a practicing clinician, there was a lot, we all have experience of substance use, and whether it's alcohol use, whether it's tobacco, whether it's recreational drugs, there's a whole area of it. And I remember the stuff I was taught at medical school, the stuff I was taught at school about addiction and about, one shot of this and you're addicted forever, and how, and my house job was in the streets of Hillbrow, so we really did see a lot of substance use, and a lot of this stuff just didn't make sense, much like a lot of HIV didn't make sense to me when I first came to it. And it's, as I started thinking about these things, it's been people like Shaun who sent me articles and who've repeatedly challenged me to come up with a more coherent philosophy almost around harm reduction. And it's my absolute pleasure to present Shaun. I'm just going to read his bio to you very quickly. So Shaun Shelly is dedicated to the development of rights and evidence-based drug policy. Shaun is the drug policy lead at TB HIV Care, where he founded the South African Drug Policy Week. He has a research post at the University of Pretoria, Department of Family Medicine. Shaun is the chair of the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs and serves on the strategic board of the Love Alliance. He brings academic, programmatic, research, clinical, and lived experience together with a 360-degree view of the complex issues that inform our understanding response to the issue of to the use of certain drugs and the people that use them. And I'm looking, again, I've heard Shaun speak several times now, and I'm really delighted that he's going to be able to share his knowledge with the Clinician Society. Over to you, Shaun.
Thanks very much, Francois, and thank you, Dimakatso. I remember actually the first harm reduction training session you were in at COSUP, which I presented, and yeah, certainly there's been a long journey for a lot of people during these processes. Okay, so I'm going to try and convey some of the principles and how to apply the principles of harm reduction. And I just want to check that I have got my presentation up. Is that correct?
It's up. Thanks, Shaun. Yes.
Okay. All right. Hopefully I've got the right side of it up. Anyway, okay. So first of all, what is harm reduction? Harm reduction is an evidence-based and public health-based approach. And it's designed to reduce the risks of the use of drugs, although of course it's not only related to drugs, and it's also not only related to drug users, because harm reduction also provides a safety net for the broader community as well. In medical settings, harm reduction is based around these particular principles. Humanism, meaning giving care without moral judgment, and with an understanding that choices are often contextual. Pragmatism, it's about just doing what needs to be done. And the origins of harm reduction were in the very pragmatic response to HIV during the 1980s, when people were dying left, right, and center, the most awful deaths. And these were entirely preventable or largely preventable through the distribution of sterile injecting equipment. And so there was quite an anarchist kind of beginning to harm reduction, where people like Julian Buchanan and Pat O'Hare in Liverpool were handing out needles and syringes, and people in the Netherlands were handing them out, despite the fact that it was against the law. And they eventually proved that this really worked. So there's a large pragmatic element to this. Individualism, recognizing people as individual people, and they have the right to autonomy. It's about incrementalism, that Rome isn't built in one day, and similarly, you're not going to resolve an issue that's been developing in somebody's life for a long time just by simply giving them a set of instructions, as Dimakatso has so eloquently explained to us. And then it's about accountability without termination, meaning people have the right to make their choices without their access to services being denied. And we see that often in the field of drug use. We see that people are excluded from services because they relapse or because they use, or they're denied access to needle and syringes because they happen to be on methadone. And of course, the problem with dealing with people who use drugs is that there is a lot of stigma attached to it. Whether we like it or not, most of us have some level of stigma. And so I think what the first part of harm reduction is to know our own biases and stigma, to acknowledge, educate, humanize, and compensate. I found one way of getting over the stigma related to drugs is to introduce people to people who actually use drugs, people who are benefiting from the services. But one of the tests I do often to test whether or not there's stigma, and let's face it, we've all got some level of prejudice, is often I show the students this advert. Champion men deserve a champion beer, and nobody bats an eyelid. But when we see this, nice people take drugs, the vast majority of people will have some sort of unease around it. This campaign was a very clever campaign because the organization that did it actually didn't have the money to put this sign up on buses, but they made a mock-up and they distributed it in the press. And of course, it got more press coverage than you can imagine and was immediately banned before it actually happened. So it just shows you the level of stigma, because we've had alcohol advertising for ages. And if we follow David Nutt's study on the multi-criteria analysis on the harms of drugs, we find that alcohol is probably the most harmful of all the drugs, including the unregulated drugs. Another aspect of medicine generally is it's common practice to provide interventions that are based on reducing rather than eliminating harms. We need a continuum of care that's incremental and often specific to the person. And this happens in a lot of fields, but when it comes to drugs, often there's a level of stigma about it, or a level of moral objection to it. And suddenly we're enabling people. Suddenly we are part of the problem, not the solution. And as I said at the One South African Addiction Medicine Conference, I'm willing to enable people to stay alive. And that's what it's about, really. Harm reduction for people who use drugs is not unique. And so we need to get over this. And we need to understand that the use of drugs is ubiquitous. Right since the beginning of time, people have been altering their states of mind to cope with various circumstances, or for religious reasons, or to find some higher plane, or just simply to get on with each other. And we're not going to see this problem go away. The dreams of a drug-free world is just that, a dream, and it's not going to be achieved. So we need to have something and some way of coping with the problems that come out of largely the unregulated drugs that are around. And how do we make this practical is quite a difficult question to answer. And so, I don't know if you can hear it, but the rain is pouring down here. So I'm struggling to hear myself think at the moment. But anyway, it's a cold and wet Cape Town. One of the principles that we can use is a thing called drug set and setting. And this was formulated first by Zinberg. And there's more to this than drugs. And when a person takes an unregulated drug, or even a regulated drug, we find that there's not a predictable chemical cascade that will result in a consistent set of results each time. Certainly there's the drug, and by the drug we mean not just the drug, we're talking about the means of ingestion, we're talking about the concentration of the drug, the purity of the drug, how it's presented. And then we get the set of the drug, which is the mindset of the individual. And also, I'm sorry, I don't know why this is changing by itself, but anyway, the mindset of the individual, and also their individual vulnerability. So we're talking about physical elements as well, maybe their past medical history, their psychiatric history. And then we get the setting, the context in which the drug is taken. And we can use this basis of drug set and setting to practice harm reduction in a very practical way. So if we have a drug, and as I said, that this involves the purity, availability, concentration, ingestion, frequency, and dose, and we've got a setting where the people are criminalized, or is it seen as a medication? Is it being used recreationally? What is the level of stigma about it? And then we've got the individual, their mindset, which is about drug expectation, for example. Most people will know that an opioid taken for the first time will often bring about nausea. And so I've actually spoken to people who've been vomiting their guts out, but saying this is the fantastic drug because they've got this drug expectation. They're expecting a hedonic experience. And although they're puking their lungs out in the early experiences, they programmed to believe that it is going to be pleasurable. But as we know, opioids do become more pleasurable. And one of the big problems with expectation is in the United States now, the message that just once is enough to get you addicted has turned a lot of people into dependent drug users when it wasn't really necessary. Prior to the economic collapse and the overprescribing of opioids, we have seen that it's a very small percentage of people on chronic opioid pain medication will actually become dependent, well, not dependent, they will all become dependent eventually, but addicted, should I say, the state of mind of addiction where they're seeking unregulated drugs when they can't get hold of the regulated drugs. But with the changes in the context and the setting and the mindset of the individual, we've seen a greater number of people progressing onto habituated and dependent drug use, which is called addiction in some people's terms and way of speaking. And an example of this, which I can give you, is in fact diacetylmorphine, or otherwise known as heroin. And if we look at diacetylmorphine as a drug, and it's given by a doctor in the context of a hospital, we find that people generally don't have too many negative side effects. It's given in a caring environment, and even in an injectable format, people tend to do all right. But when you take the same drug in an unregulated format, which is obviously less pure and it's got a lot of other substances with it, which you're not quite sure of, which is a product really of prohibition, and you put a policeman in charge of the policing of that drug, there's a lot of violence and contact with the criminal justice system. We tend to see people actually dying from the same drug, and the outcomes are very, very different. Now, in fact, one of the best treatments for addiction to heroin is diacetylmorphine. And there's a growing body of research that has shown over many, many years that people who struggle to overcome their opioid use disorders or heroin addictions using other medications, other agonists, do pretty well on injectable formats of diacetylmorphine. And in the UK, up until the sort of 70s, 80s, there were a lot of people who were prescribed diacetylmorphine. There's still about 300 or so. They prescribed it in injectable take-home doses. The majority of them are employed, and the majority of them don't have too many problems. And certainly in Switzerland, we've seen that as well. Ruth Dreyfus, who was the president at the time that introduced heroin prescribing, in a conversation with her, she was explaining that actually the biggest problem they've got today in Switzerland with heroin is the fact that they've got to supply to a lot of old age homes and have facilities for people to inject there, because it's an aging population. So when we apply the principles of drug set and setting to the harm reduction experience, we can look at any one of those three domains to try and bring about a change. So for example, if you've got somebody using methamphetamine who is becoming psychotic, talk to them about dose response. Maybe they can change the dose if they don't feel they can change the drug. Maybe they can change the setting. Maybe they can change their other behaviors around sleep, for example. One of the best pieces of advice you can give somebody on methamphetamine is to every day spend at least 4 hours lying down in a darkened room. You'll find that the episodes of psychosis or psychotic breaks decline dramatically, because the primary factor is actually sleep deprivation and lack of nutrition and lack of hydration that lead to most of the problems related around methamphetamine or took use. The other thing is to encourage people to make single possible changes. For somebody who has formed a relationship with the drug where it's actually taken the place of other more helpful relationships, to ask them to give up the drug is something which is really challenging for them to do. And they're not going to do it in one big step. You know, it took a long time for them to learn how to become addicted to the drugs. And you don't unlearn things, you just learn better ways of handling the drugs. And so what I would recommend is always look for that small change And in fact, what I try and teach people is that when somebody leaves the room, you should have done one small thing to acknowledge them, and Dee spoke quite a bit about this. Just acknowledge them in some way to show that they're special, that you're present with them, and then give them one small thing that they can do that they've selected within the next 24 hours that they can succeed at. And that might be to inject once less, it might be to smoke once less, it might be to take that final step to decide to go on to methadone, for example. For each person that is different, and make it personal and make it something that's unique to them that they can succeed at, because that builds confidence and it builds future successes. It's interesting to know that when William Miller did a study where he devised a recovery index, where they gave a test to people and were able to score their chance of resolving their drug use issues, the index worked really, really well. The only people that told about it were the clinicians. The only problem was it was totally made up and arbitrary. And when a clinician believed that their client was going to do well, they tended to do well. When they believed they were going to fail, they tended to fail. And so the approach and the lack of stigma and a non-judgmental and encompassing approach that encourages people using the principles of motivational interviewing by promoting self-efficacy, avoiding argumentation, by rolling with resistance, and showing positive regard and empathy for the individual. These things really work and are probably one of the most important things when it comes to harm reduction and the resolution of drug use disorders. But of course, this is not easy for everybody to do. We've got enough of a battle trying to convince the world that vaping is less dangerous than cigarettes. It doesn't help that a lot of people say, oh, there are 599 additives in cigarettes and only 4 ingredients in a vape substance, except we don't know whether one of those ingredients might be strychnine or not. But so that's not really a valid argument. But certainly what is a valid argument is that vaping is less harmful than smoking cigarettes. Who would you like to have, what would you like to have your own children do? Would you prefer that they vape or smoke cigarettes, even if you prefer none? Vaping is clearly less likely to cause cancer, but we have a problem selling this. And then imagine trying to sell to somebody that actually you should be training people to maybe snort their drugs rather than inject their drugs. And that becomes even more difficult. And then when you've got to train people to teach people that there's certain places that are better to inject than not inject, that becomes even more problematic because there's a lot of stigma around this. But the fact of the matter is that people are not going to stop injecting just because you tell them to, or just because they don't have access to needles and syringes. Just like if I put down a packet of heroin and some needles and syringes in front of a classroom of 50 medical students, nobody's going to run up and start injecting heroin. There are a lot of other things that are involved in this. So if somebody is going to be taking, injecting drugs, it's best to teach them that it's not a good idea to inject in the groin or in the feet or in the neck or in the legs, and to teach them the better ways and enable them to inject more safely. He was talking about what we should be looking at and imposing solutions on people. At the end of the day, the only outcome we should really be seeking is that people are most of the time making well-informed, conscious decisions about the type, frequency, method, and purpose of their drug use, whether they choose to use drugs or not. Sorry, Francois, I read that slide out because I think it's quite important. Francois hates it when people read slides out, but anyway, this is the key message, is that what we should be doing is educating people. Despite common perceptions, people who use drugs are well aware of the harm that they're causing themselves, but they continue to use in spite of it because there's an economic payoff in some level. And so if we just try and supply support for these people or provide a temporary scaffolding while they reach for the vision of future self and grow into that, then we will be making real differences in their lives. And that's the essence of harm reduction, meeting people where they're at. And those principles that are shared at the beginning, those are the critical issues and principles of harm reduction. And if you just remember that there's one of 3 things you can always change: the drug set or the setting in some small way to encourage people to make changes in their own lives. And remember, the end game is not to get people to stop using drugs, but simply to keep people alive so that they can grow out of their drug use and learn a different way of life. That's it for me, and thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Shaun. That was wonderful. I can see already the questions are starting to flow through. So keep them coming. We'll line them up so that we can have a kind of a panel discussion at the end of this. And I think that the way you summarized that was absolutely lovely. And I think often as clinicians, you feel quite helpless because your endpoint is to get them off whatever that's causing the problem or you perceive to be causing the problem. And this is a much more practical way to be able to help them, I think. So our last speaker is Andrew Scheibe. And Andrew was the one who probably started me on the path down of being interested in helping in this in terms of the Clinician Society, and has lots of experience in terms of this and engaging with these various debates, and is going to be able to help. Already I can see answer some of the questions that are flowing through. So Andrew is a medical doctor by training who works in harm reduction research programs and policy in South Africa and the region. His work focuses on the intersections between infectious diseases, determinants of health and rights. He's a technical advisor for TB HIV care and is a researcher also at the University of Pretoria. I was very sad to hear that Andrew was off to go to Mexico for a very long sabbatical, but I'm delighted to see that COVID seems to have stopped him in his tracks, and hopefully it's just a delay, but it's our pleasure to actually welcome him and have kept him in South Africa during this period to help us get some of this harm reduction work off the HIV Clinician Society plan. So over to you, Andrew. And I can see you already sharing your screen. That's wonderful.
Great, thanks very much. So I think it is fantastic that the Clinician Society is really at the forefront of sharing this information. And I think it's really encouraging to see the number of people who are on this call. So thanks very much to everyone. I am going to talk a little bit around something specific because it's a personal area of interest, and because I think it's an area where many clinicians can have a practical role, they have a practical role to play. And this is one of the areas where there is a very effective pharmacological intervention that works very well as not only a harm reduction intervention, but it also can help as one of the treatment interventions for opioid dependence. It is very important to clarify that when we talk of opioids, there is a group of substances which make up that term, and they include also opiates, which are substances that are derived from the opium poppy. But just generally thinking of opioids in our context in South Africa and our region, the most important opioid that is used is heroin. And for a range of reasons, the way that heroin is sold or the way that heroin is spoken about and the terms used differ depending where you are in the country. So for example, if you're in the area of eThekwini or KwaZulu-Natal, there's mention of Wunga, or other parts of KZN, it's called sugars. If you're in Gauteng, it's called Nyaupe. If you are in other parts of the country, it might be called smack or Thai or a range of other terms. And it is really important to note that in all of these substances, the primary product is heroin, and heroin is an opioid. The early suggestions that Nyaupe and Wunga had antiretroviral medication in them have been proven to be incorrect. And it has had a lot of damage because it's made people think that these substances are unique, that they are special, and we don't know how to treat them or how to manage them. And that's not at all the case. Opioid substitution therapy is an extremely effective treatment and a harm reduction intervention practically for opioid dependence. So we get insight into what's happening with heroin by looking at the tip of the iceberg. And the tip of the iceberg really is what gets seen in drug treatment centers. I use the word in inverted commas because historically the services that have provided drug treatment services have not provided, and many still don't provide, evidence-based treatment. And it's particularly important to note for opioids that evidence-based treatment is opioid substitution therapy. Nevertheless, we know of the people who knew about treatment services, who were able to afford them and were in areas where they're available. we note that over the last 20 years, there's been a marked increase in those people who are attending these treatment services. So there's no doubt that heroin is increasing. And there's also no doubt now, I think, in people's own cities or towns to know that wherever you are, heroin is very easily available and it is very affordable. For a very long time, there was a discussion that it wasn't a big issue or that people didn't inject, but we're now in a very different space and time. And I think just for clarity, I'm going to talk a little around opioid substitution therapy. This is a medical intervention. It is known by a range of various terms. Various terms have pros and cons. You'll also hear of it being called opioid agonist therapy. In some places, depending on the kind of medication that's used, you might hear it being called methadone maintenance therapy or buprenorphine maintenance therapy, or in some contexts referred to as medication-assisted treatment. I'm going to be referring it to opioid substitution therapy. And there are a few very important things that make opioid substitution therapy different to other interventions. And I think one of those key things is that we're using an opioid agonist medication. So it works on the same receptor of the brain. There's also the use of partial agonist medications, but it's an agonist. And what is critical is opioid substitution therapy requires the medication to be provided at the right dose, like we would with any pharmacological intervention. And like any other chronic condition, the duration of treatment is for as long as someone needs it. Some people might need it for several years, some people might need it for life. But whenever you hear people talk about low dose methadone or low dose buprenorphine, and for only a couple of weeks or a couple of months, that is not opioid substitution therapy maintenance. It is this long-term evidence-based intervention that is prescribed by a clinical provider with offer and access to psychosocial services should the person require it. It is recommended by the World Health Organization. It is the gold standard for treatment of opioid dependence. And importantly, because it keeps people alive, it reduces infectious disease, it avoids overdose-related deaths. In itself, it's an example of a harm reduction intervention. And the evidence is overwhelming about how well this works. So one of the key things about OST, particularly when it's at scale, is that they've shown its effectiveness in that it has a very good ability to keep people in treatment and in services. And that largely removes the necessity for people to avoid withdrawal and having to access illicit substance and engage in the criminal market, for example. So we know that it drastically reduces access to illicit opioids. We also know that because it's a long-acting agonist, people only need to take once a day. And by people having it at the right dose, it avoids cravings, it can avoid some of the physiological withdrawal symptoms, which are critical. And by doing that, it can also help people shift to a safer method of use of an opioid, as you heard Shaun mention. So it reduces injecting practices. And importantly, it reduces all cause mortality, but specifically mortality associated with overdose, as well as chronic infections related to HIV, viral hepatitis, and also self-harm. Importantly, it's got improvements of physical health as well as mental health. And from a more community perspective, it reduces crime, it improves quality of life. And there are several medications that are effective, in particular methadone and buprenorphine. Someone was asking in the chat, what is methadone? Methadone is a pharmacologically stable, pure product, and it is part of the opioid group of substances. Buprenorphine is a partial agonist, and that is a synthetic substance. As Shaun mentioned before, heroin-assisted treatment is another kind of medication that can be used effectively in opioid substitution therapy, particularly among people who have not responded well to methadone maintenance. And globally, in light of this effectiveness, and in particular because producing these medications are very cheap, it is highly cost effective. And as soon as you include the reductions associated with social harms and improvements of functionality, it becomes dominating in a cost effectiveness analysis. So in South Africa, and to some degree in Southern Africa, if there are people from beyond our borders, at the African Union level, there is clear support for evidence-based interventions, and opioid substitution therapy forms part of that. At a national level, encouragingly, and for the first time, our National Drug Master Plan speaks clearly around evidence-based interventions, and opioid substitution therapy is clearly listed as one of them. Encouragingly, the Health Sector Drug Master Plan also includes OST. The National HIV Strategic Plan includes OST, as well as the National Department of Health Hepatitis Guidelines. So from a policy perspective, there is support for OST. Currently, there is a draft OST plan for rollout in the public sector, and there are National Department of Health guidelines for OST development. If most of the people on this call work in the private sector, both of those medications are registered, and there are guidelines available, which I'll talk about in a minute. I think it's important just to see how OST, as an example of harm reduction in practice for people who are dependent on opioids, really exemplifies many of those principles. And the most important thing around the benefits of opioid substitution therapy, like PrEP, like antiretroviral therapy, like TB treatment, is that people take the medication and have access to it, they can receive the benefits. And like we are focusing more and more in the HIV service around differentiated care, supporting retention, that concept of making things patient-centered and rights affirming is critical. And that has been an ongoing principle in OST. And where it is provided, the benefits and the outcomes are enhanced. It should be part of an integrated package of harm reduction services. So not everyone that is that has an opioid dependence injects, but anyone that does inject needs to have access to sterile injecting equipment. There should be no ceiling dose. People should receive the dose that they're required. As I mentioned earlier, the duration for as long as the person needs it. And importantly, there is a need for people to be able to take home the medication. Where there is a strict requirement of direct observed therapy, it makes it very difficult for people to take this medication and improve other areas of their life. There is evidence showing the value of psychosocial interventions, which are voluntary, particularly if they can help other aspects of people's lives. OST provides a lot of stability for people, so they don't have to worry about going through withdrawal and can focus on other aspects. It is important to note that OST should not be and is not restricted to the realm of psychiatry. Historically, it has been, but in people that don't have complicated comorbidities, there are a subgroup of people who have psychiatric conditions. There are some people that have other chronic conditions that affect either their kidneys or their liver function. But generally, and in our context, where people have not been using opioids for decades in the norm, it is a primary care condition. And it's important to note that those people who require more complex support, there is opportunity for expert support. The people shouldn't be a contraindication to use. It's important to note some of the specific issues affecting women who use drugs more broadly. It is important to note that OST needs to be equitably accessible. There is opioid use in all parts of the country, in rural areas, and particularly along places that link the urban centers with either our borders or ports or airports. It is important that OST is available at affordable cost or no cost to the individual, and that is a major challenge currently in South Africa. It is part of a recommended intervention that should be part of health insurance, ideally and globally. The World Health Organization is pushing for that. And to be able to maximize benefit, we want to try and make access as easy as possible. So it should be low threshold. and abstinence should not be a requirement. As Dimakatso started off earlier on, and Shaun iterated, it's small incremental steps. And some people may have a goal ultimately of abstinence, but some people may not. And the intention of opioid substitution therapy is not abstinence. The intention of OST is helping people to remain alive, to improve their stability, and to give them the space to make own goals and work towards that. Critical is retention, and also services in community spaces, in public-private partnership scenarios, as well as in prison. Just thought I'd briefly talk about some of the different agonist medications that are available. So we mentioned methadone. Currently in South Africa, methadone is expensive, and it's partly, well, it's largely because it hasn't been widely prescribed, and there's currently only one registered product. And in other parts of the world, it is very inexpensive. I've just been speaking to people in Iran, and it costs $2 a month for high doses of methadone. So it's a very, very affordable medication, and it's just around market forces. One of the concerns around methadone is that it can cause cardiac QTC prolongation, particularly people who have risk factors. There is an overdose risk associated with methadone, but importantly to note that it's in the initial stages of methadone, and also if people have been through a period of decreased tolerance, so there's been a period of abstinence. So particularly if people have been in rehab, if people have been through detoxification, if people have been in prison, that's a high chance of overdose if there's access to methadone. There is this concern of diversion, but in reality, what often happens is there's a market for access to methadone if people can't get it and they're wanting to access treatment. The dosing and the process is fairly straightforward. There is a protocol to follow, and the mantra is start low, go slow, aim high. And it is possible to provide take-home doses safely. It's important to note that many of the civil society and academic OST programs that are in operation in South Africa allow take-home dosing. There haven't been major safety concerns, and it's definitely improved the retention and the ability of people to function. Then we come to two other medications. These are both got buprenorphine as the partial agonist. There is a second element which is added to one of them, which is naloxone, which is an antagonist. And it's important to note that, like in many situations, there's a strong pharmaceutical pressure on what's proposed and what's sold. But essentially, people would prefer buprenorphine. The addition of naloxone is intended to stop the injection of the product. Some of the benefits of buprenorphine is that it's got a lower side effect profile. It's easier to dose. It's in a tablet or a sublingual film format. It's got easier use for take-home doses, but in many contexts, it's significantly more expensive than methadone. And the side effect profile, etc., for buprenorphine naloxone is similar. Just again, reiterating, retention is the most critical component of OST, like it is with antiretroviral therapy. We know that for the effects and the benefits at an individual and a population level, we need to achieve virological suppression, and that requires people to take medication and be adherent, and for the services to be acceptable and patient-centric. And the same principles apply to opioid substitution therapy. Broadly, there's a process of opioid substitution therapy where initially there's a process of initiation. Again, this does not need to be in an inpatient setting. It can be safely done generally in an outpatient office-based scenario, which involves an assessment of people's medical condition, other medications as standard. It is important to offer bloodborne virus testing and to just confirm that the person has used an opioid. The school of thought that I come from does not recommend ongoing assessment using drug urine testing, because often it's used in a punitive manner. And it is important to note that often pregnancy is important, not because it's a contraindication, but that you're able to ensure and provide support for women who are pregnant who use opioids. Then the process of slow up titration. It is important to note in South Africa that everywhere people are being underdosed. and it's largely because of the high cost of the medication. And in the private sector, methadone and buprenorphine are not included in prescribed minimum benefits. So it's a really good example. And if there's a way that the Clinician Society can advocate for this, it's really important that the medical aids fund non-evidence-based interventions. So they fund, the 28-day inpatient process with outpatient psychosocial services, but they don't support OST maintenance, which is the evidence-based treatment. I think it is important to note that detoxification is not a recommended intervention. It's associated with increased morbidity and mortality, largely linked to the risk of returning to use after detox and the likelihood, if people do inject, of contracting HIV and HCV, as well as overdose. The addition of psychosocial services are important. They should be voluntary. And then really it's around getting people at the optimum individualized dose and supporting their maintenance, like is important with antiretroviral therapy, and allowing people to take home dose. It is important to have mechanisms, as Shaun mentioned, around accountability but not exclusion, particularly if there are concerns of some alternative uses of the medication. There is mention of the need for a package of services. I've just included this here because we're in the context of HIV. I mentioned many of these things. What is critical to note is opioid overdose is an issue. We don't have good data in South Africa, but it is good practice that if someone is on opioid substitution therapy, that they're provided with naloxone. The tricky thing we have in South Africa is that naloxone can't be, it's still a Schedule 1 medication, Schedule 2, it requires a prescription. It can only be injected, administered by a medical professional, but it can be provided by someone's partner or someone's family member, similarly as what would happen with glucagon or with adrenaline if someone has an allergic reaction. So it is important to note that doctors who are prescribing OST should have conversations around overdose, and they should be prescribing and providing naloxone so people have access to it. These are important additional services. Viral hepatitis is extremely important. We know there's a viral hepatitis C epidemic among people who inject drugs in South Africa, and the psychosocial services are important. Some of these things are particularly relevant for people who might be in less fortunate socioeconomic circumstances, but generally the addition of psychosocial support and counseling is beneficial. Again, just wrapping up what's happening in the current situation in South Africa. The agonist medications are registered in South Africa. They are Schedule 6. So the maximum that someone can be prescribed is a month's dose. Financing is a major problem. The methadone costs are around 2,000 Rand a month per person. And again, it should be long-term maintenance. It's not covered by the medical aids. There are currently donor-supported programs in the selected metros. And just to note that the city of Tshwane is the one metro that is funding OST, but they are unable to expand the program because of not having sufficient funds. There are some guidelines that are localized for treatment for OST. I'd encourage people to look at the harm reduction guidelines, and also the South African Addiction Medicine Society has guidelines. It is important to note that there is a difference in the philosophy that is applied from the Clinician Society to the approach of the South African Addictions Medicine Society, and it's largely around viewing OST as an abstinence as the ultimate goal versus it's a treatment, and it can also be used as a harm reduction intervention. There are National Department of Health guidelines which are being drafted, and they are to be tabled with the OST plan in front of the National Health Council soon. So just in closing, it's important to recognize that opioid dependence is increasing. And because of stigma and discrimination, people may not be forthcoming in acknowledging their opioid dependence. And people that have an opioid dependence, the treatment is not detoxification. The treatment is OST management, particularly if there's a long-term use or people are injecting. It is a very effective medicine, and it plays an important role in the context of infectious diseases, in overdose, and improving well-being. There are guidelines available, and there are opportunities for interested people to work with civil society partners. And also just to note that Shaun and others at the University of Pretoria and Love Alliance and the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs are planning to work with the Clinician Society to develop a training course for OST so that people can get accreditation and support for prescribing. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Every time I hear you speak, I feel a little bit smarter in this zone. So thanks for that. Andrew, a lot of the questions are quite technical, drug interactions and guidelines type questions, which I'm just going to give you a moment just to maybe page through them and start addressing them. But in the meantime, I've got to try and summarize some of the chat questions, and everyone keep them coming. I think there's so much to talk about here. Dimakatso, I wanted to ask you, firstly, what is the pattern of drug use that you're seeing in the areas that you're working with at the moment? Andrew talked a little bit about it, but practically on the ground at the moment, what are you seeing? And there was a question about Chem Sex, and I hadn't heard this term until 2 years ago, which I'll get Shaun to speak about immediately after this. But from your perspective, what are you seeing happening at the moment?
I primarily function in a township called Altridgeville in Pretoria, and majority of the substance that has been used is nyalpe, and there's a lot of dependency. Pattern of use is dependency. So that's what majority of my clients come with. So yeah.
Okay, and Chem Sex, is that a thing in your community, the community you're serving, or not really? Shaun, do you want to just talk about Chem Sex, because it is a very particular form of substance use from what I understand?
Yes, Francois. So Chem Sex is actually more about the sex than the chemicals. It's about heightening the experience of sex. And often methamphetamine, for example, is used because it gives people energy, perseverance, it drives their libido up, but it can have significant issues related to it as well with prolonged sex. And so some of the techniques that are used in terms of harm reduction are to, when people engaging in sex parties, to use colored bands around their wrist and on the syringes that they use so that they don't share syringes, to make lubricants very available to them, and also just to talk to people about the various risks that they face and make them very aware of them. And it's a slightly different pattern of use, typically speaking, to what you would see in your typical dependent user, because it is more purposeful in its use. So there are risks of increasing exposure to HIV with that. But if people are well educated and they make a pre-commitment to safety by, for example, using the color-coded syringes, or limiting amount of drugs that they have available to them, and using the right protection, then that's harm reduction, really, what we should be looking at.
Wonderful. And then, I'm going to ask the idiot question, Shaun, but this idea that one dose of heroin and you're hooked for life, and that's these kind of things that we actually would, it's kind of a legacy from our schooling, but even at medical school, we'd often be, this would be out there as conventional wisdom. What is the modern understanding of exposure to these drugs, and what happens to you afterwards?
Well, for the majority of people, they will use them maybe once or twice for a short period of time and then stop. And essentially, the mechanism that makes drugs sort of more problematic and habituated in their use is very similar to the mechanism that you'd use when developing a romantic relationship, for example. So it's something that's developed over time a little bit, and people sort of learn these patterns of coping. And initially, it starts off with maybe a conscious or semi-conscious reward process, where they get a benefit out of it. It makes them maybe feel part of the group, or it gives them, heroin people famously say it's like lying in the arms of your mother and lover at the same time, which is very different to the experience of methadone, for example. But heroin gives them that comfort. And when you're living with a lot of trauma, and we know, for example, that in certain studies where people have had more than 5 or 6 adverse childhood events, they're 4,600 times more likely to inject heroin later in their life. It serves a definite purpose. And then they learn the drug expectation, and they learn what it does for them. And so it's very rare that somebody will become addicted to a drug very, very quickly. It takes a bit of time, but we know that people do become dependent on drugs relatively quickly over about 7 or 8 days, usually with an opioid, you'd find some dependence, but then you down taper and people by and large won't go drug seeking again. And the learning gets catalyzed by the emotional content as well, what the context is of that particular individual. But no, people don't become addicted after just the first hit.
Dimakatso, there's a question here about people who are homeless and the kind of support structures that are there within that community. What practically is available for the average South African at the moment? Sorry, you're still on mute, Dimakatso. And I'll come to you, Andrew, just to answer some of these technical questions.
We have sites within the city where they address homeless communities. The sites where they provide a shower. Some sites provide meals for them, and they get to have an opportunity to have continuous health screen. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of shelters, but those that can, then they get an opportunity to be assessed and referred where appropriately. So ultimately, it's about giving people the platform to be taken care of and given the opportunity to receive healthcare services.
And how do people react to you, Dimakatso, when you go somebody's using your pair? How do they react to you as a healthcare worker, as a concerned person? Are they suspicious or open to that?
You mean people who are using drugs?
Yeah. But say
no,
your average your pair user, you come to them and say, I'm here to help you as a healthcare worker. How do they react?
Well, I would not say I'm here as a healthcare worker. It's more around show, you talk their language because you're used to them. And ultimately, people will always be able to assess authenticity. And what Shaun mentioned about stigma, it's very important for us to constantly reassess ourselves, because the more authentic you are about that engagement, that they are more willing to engage with you and be open with you. So it's better now than before, because I had to go through the process of self-reflection.
That's really interesting. Andrew, over to you for some of the technical questions around drug interactions and the safety of methadone. There were several questions around that. If you could mind tackling those in the meantime.
Yeah, I've also taken note of other things in the chat. But I think what's important, I'm just going to talk about Chem Sex. So also sometimes we as clinicians think that they're more drug interaction than they really are. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and also note that there are very good drug interaction apps, and the University of Liverpool has got a fantastic application, and it includes common illicit drugs. So it'll include methamphetamine, it'll include methcathinone, it'll include, which is cat. So all of the typical Chem Sex, cocaine, all of those things are included. So if you know what the client's on, you can do that. And similarly with harm reduction, is you're able to have these frank conversations with your client in a neutral way. So it's really important if you have an MSM client that engages in Chem Sex, that you can talk to them in a knowledge way, or at least research with them to give them some guidance around potential drug interactions, or where they're not. Because often what we find is doctors say, oh no, you can't do it. A really good example is, for example, tuberculosis treatment. People always say, you can't take drugs and be on TB treatment. So people choose not to take the TB treatment. And so that idea of all or nothing in people's reality doesn't work. And we are able to dose adjust if there is a potential increase or decrease in people's metabolism of various drugs. So the take-home message is being able to have frank conversations to know what drugs people are taking and their practices, and be neutral about that. And that is the most difficult thing, because we all view drug use, or often view addiction, as a negative thing. And I don't think we often enough recognize the value and the meaning, the pleasure, and often the benefits that people derive from drug use. And I think that's where the self-reflection is really important. So the University of Liverpool's got that great site. Then in terms of conversations around long-term drug use, I think we shouldn't assume that people necessarily want to change their practices or their lifestyle. And I think what Dimakatso and Shaun are saying is, by being authentic, you provide the platform that if people come and they want to change, you can help them identify a meaningful change. If you set the person up with a goal for failure, for example, they've been using opioids for many, many years, and you say, right, you can become abstinent by detoxification. you're setting them up for failure. And every time someone doesn't meet that goal, it can reinforce internalized stigma, all of these things that people talk about, you know, it's your fault for not doing this. So yeah, it's around supporting incremental change. In terms of someone was asking about detoxification in the Department of Health guidelines. So we're working really, really hard to get the Department of Health to change their guidelines to be evidence-based. And generally, you know, the National Department of Health is really good at changing their guidelines. The tricky thing comes to the cost of methadone. So methadone in South Africa is about 10 times more expensive than in other middle and income country settings. There is a shift now for more methadone to be available in hospital settings. The current guidelines, as someone put in the chat, are available for detoxification in hospital settings. It's important to note that 90% of people that go through detoxification will relapse within a year. And with every relapse, this person goes through all of those potential negative reinforcements of internalized stigma. And we have to acknowledge that being problematic. So from a National Department of Health perspective, the policy is shifting away from detoxification and embracing long-term maintenance as the treatment. In terms of harm reduction, if you can give something rather than nothing, I think that's also good. So if you do have access to other opioids, for example, tramadol, you can try that rather than nothing. During the lockdown period, the city of Tshwane and the Department of Family Medicine provided a very wide-scale program for people who were put in the mass shelters. And over that period, over 1,000 people were started on methadone. And there was this offer of tramadol by the Department of Health. But what happened is tramadol really was not feasible. So there's a limited dose, multiple tablets, multiple daily dosing, terrible side effects, and not alleviating withdrawal. So as a treatment, it's not recommended. But if you don't have anything and people need something, tramadol is better than nothing. And in terms of discharge, if someone has been through detoxification and you do have access to tramadol, you know, giving tramadol and allowing a tapering of dose is better than nothing. But noting that that's not the recommended treatment. And we're trying to encourage access to opioid substitution therapy. So it is very tricky. You can't really refer people to OST because it's not widely available. It is changing. There are small programs currently in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in Durban, and a large one in Pretoria. This is a tricky thing that always comes in, is this view of methadone being addictive. Now, what's important to note is that if someone is using an illicit substance, there is no quality control, there are adulterants, people don't know the dosage. So there are a lot of inherent risks by taking that substance, and all of those things are removed in a product that's quality assured. So there's a significant harm reduction in providing a medication that has gone through strict quality assurance. So that's one thing to note. The other important thing is there's often concurrent use of substances as well as methadone. And part of that is a philosophical acknowledgement that it's all right to use drugs. If your perspective is that it's not all right to use drugs, then you come to these resistance and these conflicts. But generally, in the South African context, people are not receiving sufficient doses to relieve withdrawal, relieve craving, and to enable only once daily dosing, particularly if they're having to self-fund it. So often people might think they're on OST, but actually they're just getting methadone, and it's not at the appropriate dose, and it's not in a structured environment. I'm going to ask Shaun also to comment a little bit about the trickiness of viewing, long-term maintenance of OST in terms of an addiction or in terms of a dependence. And then, just in terms of homelessness, what we do know is in terms of priorities is how Shaun talked about drug set and setting, that we have a lot of concurrent substance use in people who are homeless, who are experiencing homeless. And if we're able to give stable homeless stable housing to people. It's challenging, but it's significantly improves their health outcomes and significantly reduces the likelihood of overdose, and it significantly reduces the chaoticness and the consequences of drugs. So housing is a really, really critical thing, and there's this program called Housing First, which has got a couple of very core principles. And those core principles, so in the South African Health Review, there's a chapter that we've submitted around this in the Tshwane context, but really it promotes that people should have access to an option of housing, that it should be separated from the requirement of readiness for housing, that there must be access to harm reduction services and other voluntary services, and no expectation of abstinence. And that shows people's health and well-being is much, much improved. Over.
Wonderful. And there's still some other questions trickling in, Andrew, I'm afraid that you're going to need to just study and have a look at. Shaun, do you want to tackle what Andrew was putting out there? Also, the other thing, Elmer had a question here about TIC, which is obviously a movement away, but you want to talk about methamphetamine. I mean, I'm really struck at how much we use methamphetamine therapeutically in sort of, in many sort of psychiatric and psychology arenas, and increasingly in using one of them for obesity as well. So just talk about this class of drugs and what happens in South Africa about them.
Let me just, before I get on to that, just mention that one of the things with methadone is when you have insufficient doses, you don't get receptor coverage, full receptor coverage. And that's both protective of overdose because it's got a higher binding affinity than heroin. And then also it's one of the purposes of methadone is that it blocks the receptors. And so using heroin on top of it doesn't give the same high. And so people tend to start attenuating their heroin use. The other thing is that the reason why we see methadone on the streets is because people want it. Nobody's buying methadone on the streets to get high. It's a lousy drug to get high on. Whereas heroin is a better drug. So they're trying to control their levels of tolerance, or they're trying to actually moderate their drug use. And so methadone on the street is essentially a characteristic of lack of coverage, which I think is important to note. And then just on the addiction side of methadone, as I said, people don't really want to become high on methadone. It's not a great drug for that. But when you are dependent on it, you need a longer tapering period because of the longer half-life. It takes 5 days to reach your peak plasma level in your dosing. And similarly, it's going to take a longer time than heroin, which has got a very short half-life. Well, actually, heroin's got a very short half-life of about 30 seconds. It's the morphine that's got a longer half-life because it's a prodrug. So anyway, the point is that it takes longer to detox from it than it would to detox from heroin if you're wanting to come off it at a later stage. But there are people who've been on it for decades who are fine. And similarly, there are people who come off after 5 years who are also fine. It depends very much on the individual and should be their choice. And to answer the question about detoxification, if a person's goal is abstinence and they really want to detoxify, it should be on the menu for them, but it shouldn't be the first line. It should be lower down. Methamphetamine or TIC or work or similar other names is a stimulant. As we know, it's got 5 mechanisms of action on the dopamine system. And it's got a reputation for causing psychosis. But in actual fact, methadone at lower doses can be very helpful to people who've got ADHD, who are trying to lose weight, as we know, who are maybe shift workers, that kind of thing, although there might be some better drugs for that. But it's given to, for example, fighter pilots in the USA, pure methamphetamine for extended fighter missions because it improves cognition and it improves reflexes and everything in all the tests, on all scales of measure. The problem is when you take it for extended periods of time and you start getting sleep deprived, nothing in the world is going to help you resolve those issues of sleep deprivation. And on top of that, with sleep deprivation, we know that we get high incidences of psychosis. And so you've got this lot of dopamine into your system and some levels of dopamine toxicity if you're taking too much of the drug. And people then start hearing little voices. They become a little bit paranoid because of the high levels of dopamine. They're in their fight or flight syndrome. And that can lead into psychosis, particularly if you're using methamphetamine with cannabis on a regular basis. A lot of the harm reductionists sort of aren't aware of that interaction, but there's some good studies that show that if you're using a lot of cannabis and a lot of methamphetamine together, you do increase your risk of psychosis, but mainly it's the sleep component that really is the factor that brings one to the psychotic episodes. And if you've got a pre-existing vulnerability, the way to overcome that is to encourage people, as I said earlier, to spend at least 4 hours within every 24 in a darkened room, just to close their eyes for a little bit, even if they don't feel like sleeping, to lower their doses. And if you're using methamphetamine on a daily basis, do not take after 3 o'clock at night, so that you do get some sleep, and to remember nutrition is important. Sleep deprivation kills more people than methamphetamine will actually. So yeah, that's my advice on that.
Thanks so much, Shaun. That's very, very helpful. Dimakatso, do you see tick use in Pretoria at the moment? It's got a reputation for being a predominantly Western Cape drug.
Not so much in my current community. Like I said, it's Nyaupe, but there seems to be an increase of stimulants, especially amongst the teenagers. It seems to be on a rise, because I'm getting a lot of clients who report that they're on some stimulant or so. I think this speaks to a lack of research, and we need to invest a lot more in research to discovering what exactly are people using on the streets and how it will further impact them.
Great. Okay, that's very useful.
I could add to that quickly.
Please.
We are seeing increases in methamphetamine use. Typically speaking, people using Niobe were using crack cocaine as a stimulant in combination with it, but we're seeing reductions in the use of crack cocaine and increases in methamphetamine, mainly because well, not mainly because, but one of the reasons is it's more economical, it's got a much longer half-life, and the other thing is that the supply routes are now similar supply routes, and so we will see that.
Wonderful. Andrew, there's more technical questions also coming through here, which I think both Dimakatso and Shaun can also talk to if they want to add to that. But over to you, Andrew, to maybe tackle some of them. I see there's a pregnancy-related one. There's issues around methadone being used in an unmonitored way, and then just whether, you know, how dependencies develop on some of these other drugs like Buprenorphine and some of the other stuff we use. Interesting here again, we use these in some of the obesity interventions that we're looking at the moment on, you know, obesity, that we're seeing more and more a feature of antiretroviral therapy.
So, Francois, I can't see the questions. I don't know if I'm not looking at the right chat, so I don't know how to.
Oh, sorry. If you go to the Q&A icon at the bottom left, Andrew, you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Sorry, there's two separate. The chat is the one that we're doing on the right. Just there's so many of them coming through that I'm battling to move them across in a coherent way. So one of the questions I can just read to you, Andrew, if it helps, is can the panel probably perhaps comment on whether data research exists in South Africa and Africa of pregnant women with opioid use disorders? Are there guidelines that the panel would recommend for antenatal clinics and OBS gynae hospital units used to provide harm reduction to women that are found to have an SUD?
Yeah, so if you check in the South African Clinician Society guidelines, there's a subsection on services for women. And also in the SAHCS guideline, there's specific dosing recommendations. And previously it was thought that, you know, buprenorphine couldn't be safely used in pregnancy, but they both can be used safely. And it is more beneficial for a woman to be on OST than not if they've got an opioid dependence. So there are also a lot of technical briefs by UNODC and a few others, and we cite them in the guidelines to give practical guidance around management within pregnancy. And I think it is important to note you want the person to be on opioid substitution therapy throughout their pregnancy and also afterwards. Shaun, I see you want to add, and then so I would guide to resources that are linked there.
So those are excellent resources. Just to add to it, I've done quite a bit of training at Mowbray Maternity Clinic on drug use and that. And one of the questions that we always ask the medical students is, you know, if somebody's pregnant and they're using alcohol, they're using nicotine, methamphetamine, and opioids, which one's most important to stop? And depending on the level of alcohol drinking, it would be the nicotine, followed by the alcohol, followed by the methamphetamine, followed by the opioids. And opioids are not that dangerous when they're regulated opioids. And in fact, to get somebody to stop suddenly, to just stop their opioid use in first and third trimester can lead to spontaneous abortions. And so we've got to be careful with that. And the most important thing with a drug using individual who's pregnant is to keep them in care. That's what all the data says. Is if they have regular visits, if they're kept in care, they will tend to have better outcomes. And you can't make them feel more guilty than they already are. They tend to feel very guilty already. So support is essential in that kind of process.
Thanks, Shaun. That's very useful. Andrew, there's a question about dependency on buprenorphine. Is that, I don't quite understand the rest of the question, but have you seen dependency in these other drugs of any form?
So again, dependency, if we take it as the definition of a physiological adaptation that happens after repeated exposure, and when the exposure of the substance is reduced, there are physiological symptoms. So that can happen from a numerous range of things. So any of the opioids, tramadol, morphine, methadone, buprenorphine, fentanyl, all of those as opioids can cause an opioid dependence. So whichever the one is that the person has been using, as they stop using it, and once the half-life reaches below whatever threshold, they become, whatever the concentration has got to, the level that they've become accustomed to for their receptors, they will then go through withdrawal. So it applies to any of those components. Someone was asking about the withdrawal on Suboxone. So again, Suboxone is just a buprenorphine naloxone combination. And if someone has a pre-existing opioid dependence and you're then treating them with Suboxone, if they're going through withdrawal, it means that they're not receiving enough, the dose is not high enough.
Shaun, did you want to add to that? I see your hands up.
Oh, sorry, yes, that was actually an old one, but I can add to that as well. It's important to note that with buprenorphine, if somebody has got an opioid in their system, it acts as an antagonist and so will precipitate withdrawal. Whereas if they don't have it in, it will give them some level of comfort from the withdrawal from the other opioid, the unregulated opioid. And then the other thing is that the difference between Suboxone and Subutex, use the brand names, or buprenorphine and naloxone combination. Some people were injecting the buprenorphine, and so they added the naloxone, which only becomes bioavailable when you inject it, not orally. However, with some people, it does become bioavailable to some degree orally. And I know that some people can inject it without getting the antagonist effect on it. So some people respond better just to the buprenorphine, and certainly some people respond better just to the agonist on top of it. So, you know, rather than have a partial agonist, which is what buprenorphine is. So it's horses for courses, as they say.
Dimakatso, this issue of guilt Shaun was talking about, these township communities around Pretoria, is that your experience that, you know, people have this? It certainly has been my experience here in Hillbrow dealing with these populations.
Pardon, can you repeat that?
Just so Shaun was talking about guilt and people having a lot of internalized stigma and guilt. Is that your experience working in Pretoria?
Absolutely. You know, you find a client who starts very well, but immediately when now they are at a point where they are sober, they now have to deal with all of these internalized stigmatizations and feeling a lot of guilt and having to face all of the other people during their use. So the trauma is not just before. We usually talk about trauma that causes someone to use, but they also experience a lot during their substance use. So our clients suffer a lot of guilt, which is why a lot of them, their help-seeking behaviors is so limited or lowered or minimized because of the internal guilt. And it's very important to address that and target it specifically to make sure that clients feel that there's a space where they can even address that. So yeah, it's a big contributor to seeking service.
I'm going to ask Andrew just to answer one last question, and then I'm going to ask all three of you to wrap up with what do you think are the priorities for the government? If you're a boss of the country at the moment, what do you think South Africa should be doing that would make this better? That, in terms of policy, in terms of resource allocation, what kind of big bang things would you have? And I'll start with you, Dimakatso, go to Shaun, and then to Andrew. But initially, Andrew, can you just tackle Stephen's question here at the bottom, and then I'll come across to you, Dimakatso.
Is that the high dose of buprenorphine, naloxone,
Yes.
and withdrawal? So again, withdrawal happens if someone is, I think I'm a very simplistic person. So if someone is not getting enough of the medicine that they require, they go into withdrawal. So it depends on what their maintenance dose is of that and on the half-life of the medication. So usually people need to be dosed once a day for buprenorphine as well as for methadone. And if they don't get that dose and they're used to that dose, they will go through withdrawal. There are a lot of questions about drug-drug interactions. It's really important to note that they go to the Liverpool, it's an app, and you just put in all the medications and they'll tell you what can be provided. Generally, buprenorphine has got a better kind of drug-drug profile than methadone, but buprenorphine is generally more expensive. In the South African context, it's not significantly more different. Also, just in terms of prisons, so when I said that there's a risk of overdose, it's because in prison settings, people may not have access to opioids. And when they are released, they may reuse, and that's when they've lost their tolerance and they use their previous amount and they overdose. We're trying to engage a lot with prisons to try and start opioid substitution therapy programs. At the moment, there's nothing. Yeah, and then in terms of doctors selling methadone, offline, this comes to a bit of a philosophical discussion, but essentially, at least if people have access to methadone, they're not purchasing an illegal product that has got a lot of more harm. So while ideally you want people to access a program and be able to afford it, there's always a risk reduction is what we want to try and do. But then I'll hand over and then I'll have some concluding thoughts. Yeah, great questions.
They are wonderful. Thank you. This, I think for all of us trying to get our heads around this stuff and our own personal experiences, it sounds like lots of people are grappling with this. And Lauren, and Valencia, we probably have to need to do follow-ups and all of this. So Dimakatso, I'm going to let you do some final words. If you're a boss for one day, what would you tell our government to be prioritizing at this? What are the short-term wins that our country can get? What support do we need? What resources do we need?
Well, firstly, I would say that they need to be educated on substance use and substance use care in order for policies to be made relevant to the community of people who use drugs. Drop-in centers play a crucial role where people can have a space and a platform where they can get access to services, free methadone, access to needles where necessary, and all the other services around harm reduction. And so that will play a crucial role in addressing that. So I would say educate people so that they have relevant expectations. And for me specifically would be drop-in centers for people to get those services really accessible at no to very limited cost.
Wonderful and lovely wrap up there on the community level. Shaun, you're locked into the international debate about this. And I'm quite struck over the last 10 years as more and more high level presidents, ex-presidents, people have called for more rational thinking around the war on drugs and all the rest of it. What could South Africa be doing practically in this space?
I think that we're making some progress there. Look, I know that some people will disagree with me vehemently, but the decriminalization of all drug use and possession is absolutely logical. There is no purpose served whatsoever in putting people in jail for the use of drugs. All it does is creates more crime, more dependency, ensures that that person will never be able to work in the formal economy again, virtually guarantees that. It acts as a university for the gangs and a recruiting school for the gangs. It makes no sense. So that would be the number one harm reduction intervention in the country. And then take the money that they're putting into the policing of drugs and supply and demand side reduction and put it into uplifting communities. And it doesn't need more addiction treatment. What it needs is more access to general health care, more opportunities of employment, economic empowerment, and communities that are more supportive of each other and less stigmatizing. So I think most of the big interventions have nothing to do with drugs. But when we're looking at the medical interventions and that, really we need more psychologists out there to help people deal with traumas and those kind of issues. We need opioid substitution therapy, but if we've got a move towards regulated diamorphine supply as well, that would also help, and it would also help curb a lot of the crime. So those are my suggestions.
Wonderful. Andrew, finally to you, just looking at more the sort of like practicalities, you've talked about the cost of methadone, for instance, as being something we need to, as a clinician society, start, and just as a segue, there's absolutely no reason why we're paying so much money for this. As you say, the drugs costs, we pay almost 100-fold more than they do in India. Like these kind of things, we do need the Department of Health to sort of focus on, and we've got an amazing group of people in the Department of Health, at the Affordable Medicines Directorate, who we need to start engaging with to say this is an absolute priority. But what kind of practical things do you think we should be focusing on as the clinician society and the country as a whole?
So look, I'd like to just echo what Shaun said around decriminalization, and the Clinician Society already has a statement in support of decrim, and I think that's really important for people to be aware of. And also to recognize, I think, ideally, if we had a magic wand, we would address socioeconomic inequality, because that is one of the driving forces around substance use. And I think that's really where our resources should be going. So I support Shaun fully. Just to also clarify, we've been advocating a lot to get methadone onto the essential medicines list for the primary care use as OST maintenance. So that process is underway, and I think just getting that approved is really, really a critical element. I think there has to be much more strong leadership by the government, and I've been engaging with a lot of international low and middle income country programs, and one of the fundamental things is they produce their own methadone, and we have that capacity, and when you do that, it's cheap. So I think that local production is really important. And I think what we have to push for is that substance use disorder treatment, but particularly OST, is part of national health insurance. I think that's what we really, really have to drive for. And linked to that is hepatitis C treatment. I think HIV will be there, but hepatitis C is really, really a critical one. I think those would be my elements. Yeah.
No, that was wonderful. And I think just to thank the three of you for these incredibly wise words. I think you're going to have to be patient with the clinician community, because I think a lot of the stuff we have to digest, I've certainly had to just learn the right language, which I'm still learning, and just try and digest what this means for our policy and how to deal with our patients. It's been hugely helpful talking to all three of you, and certainly dealing with some of my patients and some of the helplessness I've felt as a clinician, this kind of just say no approach, which we know doesn't work for HIV, and the issues such as sex and some of the debates we've had to do there. And in many ways, this has helped me have a much more adult conversation with my patients, in terms of what to do without the expectation that they're going to be off the drugs forevermore. So I think for all of us, just to go back and think about this further, just think about in your own individual space now how we can start better advocating for evidence-based interventions, using our experience with, with HIV, with sex workers, and all the other areas, and starting to apply to a group of patients who, I think have been deeply stigmatized, including by our own profession going forward. So to thank the three of you, as I said, for your wise words. It's been really, really entertaining. I can see the fact that we had over 150 people on the seminar at one point. Yeah, we probably are going to need to have you back to start tackling this going forward. And just to thank Lauren and Valencia for putting it all together, and to Unitaid again for sponsoring this. So good night to everybody, and yeah, lots to think about. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Hey, bye.
Take care.
You too.
Thanks.